Is Trump's Middle East plan a serious effort at peacemaking between Israelis and Palestinians, or a crude attempt at bolstering his and Netanyahu's re-election? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Rida Fakhri. The fallout from the Trump administration's Middle East plan continues. The latest polls show that almost 95% of Palestinians reject the plan, while nearly 50% of Israelis believe it amounts to U.S. intervention in Israel's parliamentary elections to help Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party. Now, since the plan was unveiled at the White House weeks ago, it has been criticized by Pope Francis for its, quote, inequitable solutions, which he warned could be a prelude to new crises. Now, here in the United States, Democratic frontrunner Bernie Sanders has announced his decision to boycott AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby's annual meeting in Washington next week, saying he is concerned about the platform AIPAC provides for leaders who express bigotry and oppose basic Palestinian rights. Now, one of the key elements of this plan is to swap East Jerusalem for Abu Dis, a small, isolated suburb of Jerusalem. We went to Abu Dis to ask residents there about Trump's plan to turn their village into the capital of Palestine.
إذا الرئيس ترامب بده يكون رجل سلام ويعطي السلام، يجب أنه يتصل بالطرفين، يكون أمين ويكون عادل. يعني رجل السلام بده يكون عادل. هو أخذ الرؤية الإسرائيلية، لم يأخذ الرؤية الفلسطينية للسلام. القدس، أن تكون القدس هي عاصمة لدولة فلسطين، القدس الشرقية، أن تكون هنالك حدود لدولة فلسطين، أن تكون المناطق الفلسطينية مترابطة جغرافيا مع بعضها البعض، ليس متقطعة الأوصال. يعني أبو ديس متقطعة، مش موجودة على رام الله، مش موجودة على بيت لحم. أنا أضحكت لما تم اعتبار أبو ديس اللي هي عاصمة لفلسطين، لأنه لا يوجد فلسطيني يقبل هذا الشيء أنه أبو ديس تكون عاصمة لفلسطين. هذا شيء منتهي، ما حد بيحكي فيه.
من الصعب جدا أن يكون في عاصمة عندنا في بلدة أبو ديس، لأن تفتقر لكثير من المقومات العاصمة. أنت بتحكي يعني عندنا فيش عندنا بنية تحتية، عندنا شوارع ضيقة، أزمات السير اللي بتواجهها البلدة كل يوم مساء صباحا للخارج والداخل على البلد، يعني مشاكل كثيرة.
يعني بكينا زمان نروح نصلي كل يوم في القدس الصبح، أروح أصلي. كنت قبل ما حطوا هالجدار علينا كنت دايما أصلي الصبح وأصلي الضحى وأروح، وكنا نصل بسرعة، ما نستناش، يعني ما نتعبش، خط مستقيم. بس الحين شوف قديش مواصلات، قديش باللي فلان نتعب وإيش نوصل.
أنا من أول ما انخلقت على الحياة وأنا شايف هالجدار قدامي، لا أنت عارف تطلع تخش على ورا الجدار، ولا أنت عارف تعيش لسه في المنطقة الضفة اللي هم معطينا إياها. كيف المسجون بالضبط، إحنا عايشين حياتنا زي المسجون، مطوقينك في هالجدار، مسوين عليك دويرة وأنت حاطينك جوا هالدويرة، لا أنت عارف تطلع برا البلد ولا أنت عارف ترجع. إذا بدك تسافر على منطقة برا على الأردن بدك تمرق من الحواجز الإسرائيلية والجسر الإسرائيلي، تفتيش مش تفتيش، معجبين على الشعب الفلسطيني كله.
احنا من يوم ما انولدنا والله خلقنا واحنا نعرف انها القدس هي عاصمة فلسطين. احنا ما بلزمنا بنية تحتية، احنا القدس هي عاصمتنا الابدية. بنية تحتية اذا مشكلة اسرائيل هي بنية تحتية، واحنا بفكرنا يعني الناس يعني بدنا مصاري وبدنا هذا، عم ياخذوا 50 مليون ويطلعوا من بلادنا كلياتها. في حالة واحدة بصير اتفاق سلام، يعطونا القدس وانه نصير نصلي فيها، ولا يصير تفريق بين قدس وبين ضفة، تصير كلياتنا دولة واحدة، احنا وغزة والضفة، قدس وضفة وغزة، نكون كلياتنا يعني زي ما بيحكوها واحد. حنيتها بنفكر انه يصير سلام، غير هيك صعب جدا.
So that was the reaction from Palestinians living in Abu Dis. I'm now joined by Jason Greenblatt, President Trump's former special envoy for Middle East peace, and one of the key architects of this so-called peace plan. So Jason Greenblatt, you just heard it. It seems quite obvious that Palestinians are not buying into the administration's plan of substituting this village called Abu Dis, which is cut off from Jerusalem, by the Israeli wall for East Jerusalem. What made you and the other two chief architects of this plan, Jared Kushner and David Friedman, what made you believe that you could pull this off?
I wouldn't characterize it as pull this off. I understand that the Palestinians aspire to have a capital in East Jerusalem, or sometimes they use the phrase, East Jerusalem will be their capital. But an aspiration is not a right. The bottom line is we have two competing interests here. And I understand the Palestinians, or at least some of them, at least those who hopefully read the plan, may be a little bit disappointed. But Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. It has always been the capital of Israel since the state was founded. And I think we can make something spectacular out of the areas that we have set aside for the Palestinians.
Hold on, though. You say that Palestinians' aspirations are not rights, but these are rights that are enshrined in international law, in UN Security Council resolutions. Jerusalem was left to be decided as a final status issue by both parties. And so Jerusalem is not the undivided capital of the Israelis, as you, the Trump administration, would have the world believe.
Well, the United States passed a law in 1995 recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Israel itself has recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And the Palestinians are free to come and sit at the table and talk to Israel and see whether they can negotiate something differently. But the key is they have to come and sit with Israel. They can't keep turning things down again and again and again. I'll remind you that there was a prior Prime Minister of Israel who actually offered East Jerusalem to the Palestinians, and they turned it down back then. So I don't think that this is the reason there is no peace agreement. I think that the Palestinians have to decide, are they ready to recognize Israel as a Jewish state and sit down and come up with a realistic negotiation, one that could deliver peace and prosperity to their people, or do they want to continue fighting, rejecting, and doing what they're doing now today in Gaza, which is lobbing over dozens of rockets, one landed near a kindergarten in southern Israel.
You talk about a peace deal that would offer peace and prosperity to the Palestinians, being quite oblivious, it seems, to the fact that there's an ongoing military occupation that the United States government is condoning. In fact, this plan, to many observers, including some Israeli observers, in fact, one of the commanders of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, a former commander called Yehuda Shaul, said, what is new in this plan is the sheer audacity of calling the leftover bits and pieces of land not taken up by settlements as a state. Isn't this a classic example of chutzpah?
No, I think that's a mischaracterization. First of all, the land is disputed. It is not occupied. I think using the term occupied Palestinian territory is false, and that's part of the problem. There are a lot of mislabels that have been used in this conflict that lead people to conclusions that actually don't exist.
But Mr. Greenblatt, these are not mislabels. Whatever the United States call them, by international law and international law standards, according to the United Nations, this is occupied land.
It is disputed land. It is not occupied land. This conflict will not be resolved at the United Nations. People have to understand that. We could talk about this for decades to come. The United Nations will not be able to resolve this conflict.
So what are you suggesting then to resolve this conflict? And you have said that this is a realistic state. How does it meet the basic criteria of an independent, realistic, sovereign state when, let's face it, the Palestinian state will have to be demilitarized, so no army, not even their own military intelligence. The Israelis will be in control of all international border crossings into Palestine. Israel will also control the airspace west of the Jordan River. The state of Israel will even reserve the right to stage incursions into the state of Palestine. Can you name any other country for whom this right is reserved?
I wish things could be different, but unfortunately, from the moment Israel was founded, it was attacked by the Palestinians and its Arab neighbors, and Israel has no choice but to do what it's doing. Our deep hope is that the Palestinian leadership negotiate it, come to a final agreement with the Israelis, and over time take on more and more responsibilities. If they do their job correctly, all
but you haven't answered the question, though.
Which are valid
you've said
you have slowly
said
disappear.
Hold on, you've said that this will be a realistic state, a sovereign state. I wonder which aspect of this proposed Palestinian state lives up or even meets the basic criteria of a state when there is no sovereignty that's going to be given to the Palestinians, at least no sovereignty on their own land, no right of return, no withdrawal from settlements, and many, many more disincentives.
Well, each of those are different, right? No withdrawal from settlements, which I call cities and neighborhoods because that's what they are. Again, the land is disputed, so under what right do Palestinians demand withdrawal? Is there a peace agreement that should be established where you force people to leave their cities and neighborhoods? We crafted something that we think works. Neither Palestinians nor Israelis have to leave their neighborhoods. That's how you establish peace. Sovereignty, they'll have as much sovereignty as they could create. They will not have a military, and they will not be able to harm Israel. Other than that, they will have sovereignty, and the more they take the security responsibilities seriously, the more sovereignty aspects they will be able to achieve.
Well, you're clearly ignoring international law, but beyond that, what makes you and the other architects of the so-called peace plan qualified to put forward such an important and consequential proposal? I mean, here you are, three staunch supporters of Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Likud party with no prior experience in diplomacy or foreign affairs. On top of it, with a very skewed bias in favor of Israel. Take yourself, for instance. You're a former real estate lawyer who worked with the Trump Organization with zero diplomatic experience, a longtime supporter of the Greater Israel Project, which was a Zionist project, and you are known to have backed some of the most extremist, far-right, pro-Israel policies, including moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem and Israel's annexation over the Golan Heights. So how can you, with the lack of experience and the bias that you've displayed, how can you be the best qualified people to put this sort of proposal forward and to expect the Palestinians to accept it?
You don't need to be an expert in order to achieve peace here. In fact, I would argue there are no experts. What there are opinions. Our plan was not conjured up by the three of us alone. We worked in concert with the State Department and the National Security Council, and it represents this administration's view of how to realistically solve a conflict that has been going on for decades. This is not just a Jason, Jared, David Friedman plan. It is a plan of the United States which ultimately can only be negotiated and accepted by the two sides. No matter who the experts are with tons of diplomatic experience, whether they come from the United Nations, the European Union, or anywhere else in the world, it doesn't matter what we all say. What matters is the two sides have to get together and negotiate directly. We think we've given them a platform to do so.
No, well, as far as I know, you have not involved a single Palestinian official in these negotiations. And furthermore, you seem to completely belittle the concept of experience. But how then can you expect the Palestinians to accept a proposal that was put together largely by two US officials who have had direct dealings in funding the construction of illegal Israeli settlements? I mean, here it is. It's documented. The Kushner Companies Charitable Foundation was funding a hardline Israeli settlement in the West Bank, according to a 2017 piece by watchdog and investigative group ProPublica, while at the same time Jared Kushner was pushing forward a so-called peace plan.
Our administration has taken a different approach. We do not believe settlements are illegal per se, as Secretary Pompeo said back in November. So I understand that we may be at odds with certain countries in the world about that issue, but we do have a different opinion on it. And the settlements have long been used as a lightning rod and an excuse for why there's no peace. Irrespective of the settlements, what's happening now is the Palestinian Authority refuses to engage. And I do want to correct the record. We had many, many meetings with the Palestinian Authority throughout 2017. Their opinions were conveyed to us. They gave us lots of thoughts. So for people to suggest that they weren't involved or didn't have a seat at the table is categorically false.
Well, to correct the record, though, as far as I can tell, it is the United States administration, this current administration, that took all sorts of measures to cut the Palestinians off. In fact, by cutting funding to the Palestinian Authority, cutting funding to UNRWA, ordering the PLO to close their offices here in Washington. So I'm not quite sure how you tried to engage them. But beyond that, you yourself and Jared Kushner keep reiterating the fact that this is an unconventional approach. All you've done is you've taken old, recycled ideas and maps that were put forward about 40 years ago when Ariel Sharon, in fact, was agriculture minister and was looking at expanding the settlements, that it was put forward by a member of the Knesset called Robles in Israel, who also happened to be the head of the settlement division within the World Zionist Organization, that this is his exact plan. That's what you've done.
No, that's not the reality at all. There's nothing that I wrote in that plan, and I wrote most of the plan, that I looked at a plan from 40 years ago or maps from 40 ye's ago to create it. So whoever's spreading that rumor is spreading misinformation. As far as our decisions, each of those decisions that you referred to was grounded in U.S. law. This is United States taxpayer money that we have an obligation to watch wisely. The Palestinians are not entitled to it just because they've always received it. We think UNRWA is a corrupt organization. We think UNRWA does not lead to better lives for Palestinians. We think UNRWA just creates an ever-expanding pool of beneficiaries, and that is not a wise use of our taxpayer money. We have the right to decide what to do with U.S. taxpayer money. The closing of the PLO office was also grounded in law. President Abbas stood in front of the United Nations in 2018 and chose to threaten Israel at the International Criminal Court, which triggered that law, which is why we closed the PLO mission. I'm sorry, that was in 2017. Each of our decisions is grounded in what we believe we are responsible to do for the U.S. taxpayer or under U.S. law. The Palestinians do not have the right to determine what we do under our laws or what we do with U.S. taxpayer funds.
Jason Greenblatt, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.
So then, how do former negotiators and advisors to both parties assess this American proposal? Joining us now from London is Daniel Levy, a former Israeli negotiator. He was a senior advisor to the Israeli government between 1999 and 2001. He is currently president of the U.S. Middle East Project. And Khalid al-Gindi. He was involved in peace negotiations as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership from 2004 to 2009. He is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington and is the author of the book Blind Spot: America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump. Daniel Levy, you've been involved in the negotiations between the two sides. When you hear Jason Greenblatt, who says he drafted most of this latest Trump-Kushner plan, what do you say to him? He obviously is singing the praises of this deal, thinks that the Palestinians should obviously take it as a wonderful opportunity. But you, on the other hand, say it shouldn't be called a peace plan at all. Why not?
I really don't know what to make of what we've just heard from the former envoy, Jason Greenblatt. I don't know whether the man is such an intellectual lightweight as to be embarrassing, a real pygmy when it comes to his understanding of these things, or whether he is deeply cynical, because the document that he claims to have been having the major hand in, I actually assume that it was an Israeli hand that wrote most of this text, but that document is almost the mirror opposite of what a peace plan needs to look like. It humiliates one party and finds only truth and justice with the other party, and as such, it deeply sets back the cause of peace. So the question to that gentleman is, do you really believe that by insulting in the course of 181 pages, dripping with indignity and racism towards Palestinians, do you really think that advances the ball? Or were you intentionally putting forward a document for the Palestinians to reject it so that you could go ahead with the plans that Israel and America have for creating a permanent apartheid system for Palestinians?
It's hard not to look at this cynically, Khalid al-Gindi. So following on what Daniel Levy has just said, and it's quite telling to hear a former Israeli negotiator cast so much doubt on this sort of plan. In fact, he has even written recently that this is a hate plan, this is no peace plan. For you, as someone who's advised the Palestinian side, do you think that this was what was at play, a cynical ploy, some kind of an attempt to put forward a plan that was so unappetizing for Palestinians that they had to reject it?
I do think that. I do think there is a great deal of cynicism, a cynicism that is rooted in deeply held ideological beliefs. They have this is a wing of the Republican Party and of the Israeli political spectrum that views all of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea as essentially divinely bestowed upon the Jewish people, and that Palestinians are there really by the sufferance of the Jewish state and should be grateful for their mere existence there. And so I think Daniel's analysis is exactly right. It is a document that is rife with contempt for Palestinians, for Palestinian aspirations, for their historical narratives, and adopts wholesale the most extreme Israeli historical narratives. And so I do think that it is intended to elicit a Palestinian rejection, but it also, I think they would very much like to have Palestinians sign on to it And so for them, it's a win-win.
But
If
is there any way
Palestinians
this
sign
could have
on,
happened? Is there any way Abbas or anyone else could have signed on to this?
No, of course they couldn't, because it negates not only their rights, but even their whole history.
What about the domestic politics and how this plays into the whole idea of bolstering Netanyahu and his Likud government, Daniel Levy? Again, Greenblatt saying this is a realistic plan. You're calling it a Bantustan arrangement. You're saying that it oozes racism and colonialist supremacism. But does it eventually just fit into Netanyahu's plan of getting re-elected?
The effect, and Khalid touched on this, is to empower the most extreme elements on the Israeli side, and they are anyway in the driving seat today. Now, interestingly enough, this has not actually led to a change in voting intentions in the forthcoming Israeli election if the polling is accurate. But what it has done, it has set an agenda that the right probably believed they could never pursue with American endorsement, and it has helped trap the Israeli opposition party and the opposition leader, who has not come out and shown himself as someone committed to equality, justice, or peace, but he has come out as not in league with the extremist settlers. And he now found himself on the defensive, and I think this was the goal. It wasn't so much to immediately help Netanyahu in the election, it was to make sure that whoever came into power would have a hard time ducking this plan. And that's why you said, strange to hear an Israeli negotiator from the past perhaps have these positions. But I think what this has done, it has helped trap the Israeli system into going further down the road toward there being no turning back from creating one unequal political space. And that means you either have apartheid or you eventually have equal rights for all.
So where do the Palestinians go from here? Because in addition to helping his good friend Netanyahu, whether he needs it or not at this stage, Trump seems to also be trying to speak to his own evangelical base here in the campaign.
He is, and that's simply Trump's style as president on a whole range of issues, not simply foreign policy. He is very much ringing the bells and raising the flags for his electoral base. I think it's also designed to do the same thing in American politics, and that is by moving the goalposts so dramatically to the far right. They are trapping Democrats in this country, trying to get them to sign on to this plan, which is the only way forward, and to not only remove chances for going back to the old type of a peace process based on the 1967 lines and at least nominally based on international law, but to burn the bridge entirely so that even a future Democratic administration could not go back to the old two-state 2-4-2 type of formula.
But any future American president could walk this back, though, to a certain extent, couldn't they? For the Palestinians, which of the top contenders would spell the best, brightest future?
You've got Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, I think, on one end, and Joe Biden and Mike Bloomberg on the other, sort of repeating AIPAC talking points and the standard line about unshakable commitment to Israel. And that's what this plan is depending on. It's depending on sort of creating this rupture among Democrats, forcing them at least to be divided, and have some of them actually sign on to their approach.
Does Bernie Sanders, from your vantage point, Daniel Levy, does he represent the best hope for Palestinians if he were to become the next president here in the US?
I think the question is, do you take a whole different approach to this issue? And do you have a Palestinian leadership that is ready to take a different strategy as well? Because the obvious and the worst possible course of action would be to say, okay, now we have two terms of reference. We have international law and we have the Trump plan. Let's split the difference between them. And I think that's also part of the intention. And that's what one mustn't do, which is why one has to just really go back to basics and say there is a power dynamic, there's an asymmetry here. How do you get the most powerful party, the Israeli side, to think twice about the direction it's going in? And there America has the leverage. And will you have a president, whether it's Bernie Sanders or anyone else, and he has suggested he'd be willing to do this, but do you have a president who's willing to think again about that most basic equation? If yes, there's a way forward. If not, this Trump plan marks a dark, dark moment in the history of this conflict and in where it eventually goes, which is decades of a struggle for equal rights against an apartheid reality.
Daniel Levy and Khalid El-Guindi, thank you both.
Thanks for having us.
So while Trump's so-called peace deal, concocted by staunch supporters of Netanyahu, has proven to be a radical departure from previous official American foreign policy, Palestinians are now left to fend for themselves, knowing that they can no longer count on the support of Arab countries whose governments are all too eager to please the American president. Whether the proposed plan will put Netanyahu or Trump over the finish line remains to be seen. What is clear, though, is that the Palestinians may have to wait for new administrations in Washington and Tel Aviv to start any meaningful peace negotiations. From me, Rida Fakhri, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next time.